Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.'" The Gospel of the Lord. When the poor one called out, the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him. This line from the Psalms today gives us a simple message: to ask for help when we need it. But while it sounds easy, in reality, it's not always that easy. Oftentimes, doing so requires courage. And courage is a virtue that stands at the center of who we are called to be, courageous sons of the Lord. And examples of this aren't that hard to find. We can look to the stories of two men, one poor and one rich, and how those stories impact us to find out how to be what we are called to be. So first, a poor man. Kevin Hines was a seemingly ordinary college student from San Francisco. And while on the outside everything looked great, on the inside things were different. Before he was adopted, he was cared for by his biological parents, a couple who had become addicted to drugs and used to leave him in hotel rooms while they would go off to get high. Eventually, police set him free to a new family, and although he was a new person with a different name, Kevin ended up sharing the same mental illnesses that plagued his biological family. He suffered from depression, bipolar disorder, mania, and even hallucinations. The inner turmoil of the voices screaming inside of his own mind, shouting above the love that indeed surrounded him, is what led Kevin to September 24th, 2000. On that day, Kevin got on a bus and he rode to the Golden Gate Bridge. He got off and he walked along the sidewalk for a while. He says that he was desperate for someone to see his pain, but no one did. Eventually, a lady came up to him, not to ask if he was okay, but to ask him to take a photo of her. And for Kevin, that was it. After she left, he backed up to the street, ran as fast as he could toward the railing, and using both hands, threw himself over the bridge to the water below. Today's gospel presents us with a story of another son who seems to be in every way the exact opposite of Kevin. This son was rich. He had everything: a loving family, money. He didn't want for anything that he either needed or wanted. But all of this brought him to fall into greed, a greed that led him to take his share of the family fortune and to waste it on seeking out the very environment that police saved Kevin from. It's a story that we know well. It's a story that makes us think of paintings by Rembrandt of the father embracing his son who was dead and had come back to life. Sometimes we hear this story and we think of the ticked off older son or the father, and we try to place ourselves with one of those characters, but I think that's too simple. I think there's more here. I think that Kevin and the younger son are both models to us of the courage that the psalm calls us to. You see, when Kevin jumped off of the bridge, he became one of over 2,000 people to have done so. But he also became only one of 20 to have done so and survived. And when he tells the story, Kevin says something that's common to the other 19 survivors, that as soon as his hands left the metal railing, he instantly regretted what he did. All of those voices that were shouting in his head were silenced, and he had a moment of clarity. Kevin had 4 seconds before he would hit the water, and he used those 4 seconds to scream out to God, begging to be saved from his own mistake. When the poor one called out, the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him. Now, the younger son in today's gospel didn't jump off of a bridge, but like Kevin, he had a moment of clarity, a moment where he could say to himself what we all probably need to say: crap, I screwed up. It was a moment that didn't come while in free fall, but from being surrounded by filthy swine who enjoyed a better life than he did. And in the midst of that clarity, we find Kevin and the younger son's courage. Kevin wasn't courageous because he jumped off the bridge. He was courageous because in his moment of clarity, he decided to take advantage of the gift he had been given. With his prayer answered and his life spared, Kevin decided to make the most out of the gift he had been handed directly from God. He threw himself into rehabilitation. He made a remarkably quick recovery, and he's dedicated his life to telling his story, to advocating for mental health care, and to showing every person he meets that the truly courageous man is the man who asks for help when he needs it. And although it took nearly starving to death to recognize it, the young man in today's gospel realized that he messed up. And if he wanted to get his life back together, he was going to have to ask for help too. Specifically, help from the very person he betrayed, his father. An act that requires nothing less than true courage. Kevin and the younger son really are examples of people who heed the words we heard in the psalm. When the poor one called out, the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him. But what does any of this have to do with us? Well, we're a community of men, and like most men, we likely think of courage as being a manly virtue. Courage is something that men should have. And we, like most men, can also be stubborn, or as my mother likes to call me, hard-headed. How often do we fail to recognize what Kevin and the younger son came to know? That courage, true courage, means getting over our hard-headedness. It means recognizing that we can't do things alone, that we make mistakes, and we need to ask for help when we need it. For us, though, I hope that courage doesn't come from jumping off of bridges or nearly starving to death. So what does being courageous look like? Well, it could look like reaching out to a brother to offer an apology for being a jerk. Maybe it's reconciling with a professor or a formator that we've disrespected. It could be something as simple as making a much-needed appointment with Sister Patty or Sister Diane. Maybe it's reconciling with God for all those times we failed to use our lives for Him. Those times when we've spent more time with beer bottles in our hands than we have rosaries or breviaries, or more time sitting in front of a TV set than we have the Eucharist. All of this means change of some sort. Change that isn't easy, change that requires courage. But the good news is that courage is something that we already have. Courage is a gift that was given to us by God at our confirmation, but it's a gift we forget about if we don't cultivate it. And cultivation is work that isn't easy. Sometimes it sucks. The young man in today's gospel thought so. It's work that grows tiresome. It's work that makes us weary. And I think this is why the church gives us this story in Lent. Lent is a time for change and growth, but it's also a time where we can grow weary. How many of us have fallen over and over again with our Lenten practices, or just given them up completely? We, like the younger son, can grow weary. But I think this is also why the church gives us these words on the fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday, because today truly is a day to rejoice. Today is a day where we remind ourselves that in cultivating the virtues within us and growing in courages, we can't rely on penances alone. We can't just spend our lives beating ourselves up. But we have to rejoice in the goal that's in sight, the power of Easter, the resurrection, the mercy of God. We rejoice in receiving the same gift that Kevin and the younger son received, another chance. My brothers, we are called to be sons of the Lord, courageous sons of the Lord. And we know it's hard work. Putting our hands to the plow isn't all that fun. But today, instead of growing weary, let's rejoice. Let's once again resolve to enter more deeply into this Lenten season and to rejoice in moving forward with the examples we hear of today. But let's also not be afraid to ask for help along the way. Even Christ didn't bear his cross alone. And let's always remember the words of the psalm. When the poor one called out, the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him.